Today we go back to January 1976 and the death at the age of 85 of the best-selling novelist of all time, Queen of Crime, the creator of Hercule, Poirot and Miss Marple, Agatha Christie.
The dining room at Wallingford, which is where she died, had a moderate-sized circular dining room table, and my grandfather put all the letters that we all received in the middle of the dining room table. And by the time of the funeral, there was a sort of a huge pile of these letters. I mean, it wasn't just sort of filled in one layer. And I remember him looking sort of slightly desperately at me and saying, "Look at those, Matthew," he said, "and not an unkind word."
Matthew Pritchard, Agatha Christie's only grandchild.
She was just a loving and very attentive grandmother. I mean, my mother was an only child, and so am I. And so, we were, I think, very much both of us the apple of my grandmother's eye.
It must have been deeply moving for all of you, seeing how much affection she was held in.
Yes, and there genuinely aren't, I think, in any era, many people who can genuinely say that they never made an enemy in the world, but I think she was genuinely one of them.
I know you've been quoted as saying she was a great listener.
She was a great listener, and I remember going to lunch with her at Wallingford when she wasn't writing, took my friends either from school or Oxford, where I was, and I don't think they were expecting somebody to take such an interest in whatever it was that they were reading at Oxford, or what they were doing, or what they intended to do, and how much knowledge between them my grandparents had of so many subjects. But the main thing that she was always interested in, whenever you took anybody to meet them, was what they were doing. And I can't remember hardly any of them persuading her to talk of what she did.
And of course, what she did was extraordinary. By the time Agatha Christie died peacefully at her home in Oxfordshire, she had written more than 80 books, most of them detective novels, but also romances written under a pseudonym, short stories, poetry, and also plays. Her most famous play, The Mousetrap, opened in 1952 and is the longest-running show in history. In the night of her death, St. Martin's Theatre in London, where The Mousetrap still plays, dimmed its lights in her honour.
When they heard of her death today, the management considered whether to cancel tonight's performance. But they decided that probably Agatha Christie would have been the last person to want such a thing.
So what was the secret of Agatha Christie's enduring appeal? She herself put her success down to a lack of education.
People often ask me what made me take up writing. You see, I put it all down to the fact that I never had any education. Perhaps I'd better qualify that by admitting I did eventually go to school in Paris when I was 16, but until then, apart from being taught a little arithmetic, I'd had no lessons to speak of at all. Although I was gloriously idle, I found myself making up stories and acting the different parts, and there's nothing like boredom to make you write. So by the time I was 16 or 17, I'd written quite a number of short stories and one long, dreary novel. By the time I was 21, I'd finished the first book of mine ever to be published, The Mysterious Affair at Styles.
The intense interest aroused in the public by what was known at the time as the Styles case has now somewhat subsided.
She was always brought up by her own mother, to whom she was devoted, to be independent and to do things her own way. And I think that she sort of felt her way almost into writing books. The first one, Mysterious Affair at Styles, was turned down by more than one publisher. We have a wonderful letter in our archive from a publisher rather pompously refusing to publish her book. But I think that one of the things she would have been very worried about the world we live in nowadays is the constant pursuit of fame. If anything, my grandmother was the reverse of that. She would like to do anything with her life other than being famous. And of course, that wasn't to be granted to her.
Success was swift. After that first novel, published in 1920, still in print today, others quickly followed. Readers loved these genteel murder mysteries with their twists and turns and red herrings. By 1926, Agatha Christie was already an established writer. But that year, something happened that still puzzles her fans. Agatha Christie briefly disappeared. A national manhunt was launched after her car was found abandoned. The entry in her autobiography isn't really forthcoming.
After illness came sorrow, despair and heartbreak. There is no need to dwell on it.
Her mother had just died, her first marriage was collapsing, and she just disappeared for 11 days, didn't she?
I've never really understood that. I mean, I do fairly strongly believe that what she suffered from, I mean, I don't know what its medical name is, but it is rooted in deep unhappiness. All this happened at a time when, not only was her husband in the process of leaving her, but her mother died, and suddenly her whole world crashed from beneath her. And I think it can provide unexpected effects on your health and your ability to memorize things, and maybe an unconscious desire to go away somewhere and wish you weren't there. And, she never talked about it, nor did my mother. But one thing I am convinced about is that there wasn't anything artificial about it. Whatever it was she felt, she couldn't help it.
And her grandson says she would have hated all the attention. Agatha Christie was deeply shy. She hated public speaking and rarely gave interviews. She did give one, however, to the BBC in 1955.
I do find one's friends are curious about the way one works. What is your method, they want to know. Well, the disappointing truth is that I haven't much method. I type my own drafts on an ancient but faithful machine I've owned for years, and I find a dictaphone useful for short stories or for recasting an act of a play, but not for the more complicated business of working out a novel. No, I think the real work is done in thinking out the development of your story and worrying about it until it comes right.
I think she liked challenging herself. The one thing that she was never short of was ideas, and even now we possess 60 or 70 of her notebooks in which, in appalling handwriting, she used to write down odd scraps of ideas and things and then join them up together.
Her first book had the character of Hercule Poirot in it, didn't it? And then, of course, we got Jane Marple as well. Who were the inspirations for those two characters?
Hercule Poirot was always supposed to have stepped off a bus in Torquay in company with a number of other Belgian refugees, and that there was one of them who had this sort of egg-shaped head and fairly small moustache and all that kind of thing. And that occurred at a moment when she was trying to think of a detective who would be distinctive and nothing like Sherlock Holmes or any other detectives that were around at that moment, and that seemed to fit. And Jane Marple, I think, was a mixture of her mother, and I forget whether she was her aunt or her great-aunt, and obviously was a sort of the epitome of Englishness, and I think she had perhaps one or two characteristics of my grandmother herself.
Jane Marple and Hercule Poirot would soon become the two best-loved characters in English literature. Their stories translated into more than 100 languages. They still appear on film and TV. Matthew Pritchard has devoted much of his life to his grandmother's work, and he started young. Agatha Christie gave him the Mousetrap for his 9th birthday. Today he chairs the multi-million-pound company that deals with her affairs.